The War of 1812 and the failure of the First Bank of the United States led to great inflation. As a result, Congress decided to make the Second Bank of the United States. Most farmers, politicians, and local bankers disliked the Second Bank of the United States because it made the federal government have more control of local banks. Maryland, in particular, was extremely unhappy with the founding of the Second Bank of the United States. They believed their ability to regulate credit within their state was in jeopardy. As a result, the Maryland legislature passed a law that taxed out-of-state banks, including the Second Bank of the United States. When the federal government refused to pay the tax, the leading cashier in the Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States, James W. McCulloch, was sued.
To the necessary and proper clause, a law must be necessary for it to be passed in Congress. The Second Bank of the United States was not necessary for the survival and success of America, so therefore it is unconstitutional. Additionally, the Constitution does not say anywhere that Congress has permission to make such an institution. Therefore, the Second Bank of the United States is unconstitutional and should be immediately destroyed. If the American government can control us, why can't we regulate them? Our taxing of the banknotes is fair and acceptable under the Constitution.
Your Honor, the bank was indeed a necessary and proper action. The making of this bank is not strictly in the Constitution, but is an implied power. The Constitution cannot have possibly written every minuscule detail about whether or not the bank should exist. The Constitution is simply the framework of America and should be interpreted loosely. Therefore, since the Bank of the U.S. is constitutional, the state of Maryland cannot tax it, especially because it is so important to the well-being of this country.
Supreme Court has reached a decision. James McCulloch and the Second Bank of the United States is innocent upon the charges of unconstitutionally forming a federal bank. Maryland is guilty upon taxing banknotes illegally and unconstitutionally. The creation of the First Bank of the United States gave Congress an implied power that they could make a second one. This bank was argued and debated over in Congress, just like any other law would be. Therefore, the Second Bank of the United States is constitutional. The states now retain the ultimate power in deciding laws. It was not the states, but it was the people that first ratified the Constitution. Since the people are represented by Congress, it's the people's decision to have the Second Bank of the United States. Therefore, the creation of the Second Bank of the United States was constitutional, and Maryland's taxing of the bank was unconstitutional. While the Constitution doesn't blatantly state that the Congress can form a central bank, the Congress does have the power to vote and enact such an institution. Therefore, the creation of the Second Bank of the United States is constitutional. Maryland's argument that under the necessary and proper clause, a power must be necessary for Congress to implement it. It's been ignored. If this were true, that every law must be necessary for Congress to pass it, many of our current laws and orders would be unconstitutional because they weren't necessary. The word necessary does not mean that Congress can only pass it if there is no other solution. It means that the law must be appropriate, not essential. Therefore, the Second Bank of the United States is constitutional.
The decision in the court was a unanimous one. Maryland's argument was shut down. In the final decision, Marshall stated, "The power to create implies a power to preserve." His point was that the government could go to certain means to defend an institution that it had legally formed. He also said that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. This means that the state has no right to put into effect an effort to destroy the legally created federal organization. Some people believe that John Marshall's court decision was biased, but we believe this is not true because McCulloch won with a unanimous vote by the Supreme Court. This decision was more than just the choice to limit the power of states. As a result of McCulloch v. Maryland, the idea of a loose interpretation of the Constitution was more accepted and put into effect. Furthermore, it gave the federal government more power. Before, many people believed in a strict view of the Constitution, in which the government can do what is in the Constitution and nothing else. This case set in stone the loose interpretation policy and has enabled our country to grow and flourish more than it ever could when it had a strict view of the Constitution.